Administering Windows Server Hybrid Core Infrastructure AZ-800 exam valid dumps can guarantee you success in the first attempt. 1. You have a server named Server 1 that runs Windows Server. You plan to host applications in Windows containers. You need to configure Server 1 to run containers. What should you install? A. Windows Admin Center. B. The Windows subsystem for Linux. C. Doctor. D. Hyper-V. 2. You have two servers that have the Hyper-V server role installed. The servers are joined to a failover cluster. Both servers can connect to the same disk on an ISCSI storage device. You plan to use the ISCSI storage to store highly available Hyper-V virtual machines that will support live migration functionality. You need to configure a storage resource in the failover cluster to store the virtual machines. What should you configure? A. A storage pool. B. Attributed file system, DFS, replication. C. A mirrored volume. D. Cluster shared volumes, CSV. 3. Your network contains an Active Directory Domain Services, ADDS, forest. The forest contains 3 domains. Each domain contains 10 domain controllers. You plan to store a DNS zone in a custom Active Directory partition. You need to create the Active Directory partition for the zone. The partition must replicate to only 4 of the domain controllers. What should you use? A. ntdsutil.x. B. Active Directory sites and services. C. New AD object. D. Active Directory Administrative Center. 4. Your network contains a Active Directory Domain Service, ADDS, forest named contoso.com. The forest root domain contains a server named Server1. Contoso.com. A two-way forest trust exists between the contoso.com forest and an ADDS forest named fabricam.com. The fabricam.com forest contains 10 child domains. You need to ensure that only the members of a group named Fabricam, Group 1 can authenticate to server1.contoso.com. What should you do first? A. Change the trust to a one-way external trust. B. Add Fabricam, Group 1 to the local users group on server1.contoso.com. C. Enable SID filtering for the trust. D. Enable selective authentication for the trust. 5. Your network contains an Active Domain Services, ADDS, forest. The forest contains 3 domains. Each domain contains 10 domain controllers. You plan to store a DNS zone in a custom Active Directory partition. You need to create the Active Directory partition for the zone. The partition replicate to only 4 of the domain controllers. What should you use? A. Active Directory sites and services. B. Active Directory Administrator Center. C. DNSCMD.x. D. DNS Manager. 6. You have a server that runs Windows Server and contains a shared folder named User Data. You need to limit the amount of storage space that each user can consume in User Data. What should you use? A. Storage spaces. B. Work folders. C. Distributed file system, DFS, namespaces. D. File Server Resource Manager, FSRM. 7. You have an on-premises network that is connected to an Azure Virtual Network by using a site-to-site VPN. Each network contains a subnet that has the same IP address space. The on-premises subnet contains a virtual machine. You plan to migrate the virtual machine to the Azure subnet. You need to migrate the on-premises virtual machine to Azure without modifying the IP address. The solution must minimize administrative effort. What should you implement before you perform the migration? A. Azure Extended Network. B. Azure Virtual Network NAT. C. Azure Application Gateway. D. Azure Virtual Network Peering. 8. You have an Azure virtual machine named VM1 that runs Windows Server. You have an Azure subscription that has Microsoft Defender for Cloud enabled. You need to ensure that you can use the Azure Policy Guest Configuration feature to manage VM1. What should you do? A. Add the PowerShell Desired State Configuration (DSC) extension to VM1. B. Configure VM1 to use a user-assigned managed identity. C. Configure VM1 to use a system-assigned managed identity. D. Add the custom script extension to VM1. 9. You have an on-premises Active Directory Domain Services (ADDS) domain that syncs with an Azure Active Directory Azure AD tenant. The domain contains two servers named Server 1 and Server 2. A user named Admin1 is a member of the local administrators group on Server 1 and Server 2. You plan to manage Server 1 and Server 2 by using Azure Arc. Azure Arc objects will be added to a resource group named RG1. You need to ensure that Admin1 can configure Server 1 and Server 2 to be managed by using Azure Arc. What should you do first? A. From the Azure portal, generate a new onboarding script. B. Assign Admin1 the Azure Connected Machine onboarding role for RG1. C. Hybrid Azure AD join Server 1 and Server 2. D. Create an Azure Cloud-only account for Admin1. 10. Your network contains an Active Directory Domain Services (ADDS) domain. You have a Group Policy Object (GPO) named GPO1 that contains group policy preferences. You plan to link GPO1 to the domain. You need to ensure that the preference in GPO1 apply only to domain member servers and not to domain controllers or client computers. All the other group policy settings in GPO1 must apply to all the computers. The solution must minimize administrative effort. Which type of item level targeting should you use? A. Domain. B. Operating system. C. Security group. D. Environment variable.